taken the other job?
Oh yeah, I mean there's all kinds of crossroads in everybody's lives, right? If you had done this instead of that, if you'd gone to that school instead of that one, if you'd taken that job instead of that one, married that person instead of that one, you know, that kind of stuff, right? And I tease, my wife knows, I tease about that stuff because I've been married for 30 years. So we've got a very good relationship.
I think about that every time I see you.
So anyway, back to what we're talking about. They sent me to Korea and they put me in the current intelligence world, which is basically guys that are focused on what's going on in the world right now around us. Our focus, as you might expect in South Korea, is the North Koreans, who are the communists. And so for about 6 months I was a political and economic analyst, which means I was looking at their economy and what's going on in their country economically.
And you could have been killing people.
Well, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because there's baggage that goes along with that.
There you go.
But anyway, back to what I was saying. Then I became an airline analyst, and I focused on the North Korean Air Force for about a year and a half. Following that, I got to finally use my Russian. The Air Force sent me to the on-site inspection agency in Washington, D.C. And I spent the next 3 years working as an arms control inspector. And our job, the division that I was assigned to, was called monitoring operations. Our job was to man a facility in Russia 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long. We had been there since 1988, and I got there in 1996. And our facility sat outside of a Russian missile facility where they produced the SS-20 and the SS-25 intercontinental. Well, intermediate range, one and the other was much longer range. And they had been banned. In your history classes, you guys will probably hear about arms control treaties that were signed in the 70s and 80s and 90s. One of them was called the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And under that treaty, we banned an entire class of missiles. The SS-20 for the Russians was one of those. So our job was to be outside the factory and make sure that anything that went out of that factory was not an SS-20 missile. So we had the rights to actually open up rail cars that came out. These are big, big missiles. I mean, they're like 40, 50 feet long. And we had the right to go inside and measure and make sure that they weren't being produced. Yes, sir?
But they didn't do nuclear treaties?
Okay, these were nuclear weapons. They were intermediate range nuclear weapons. Under the treaty, the Soviets could not produce SS-20s anymore, and the United States could not produce the Pershing II missile anymore. And so the Soviets actually had a site, just like ours, in Utah, outside the production facility for the Pershing missiles. So we were over there, and they were over here. Yes, sir?
Why were they banned, sir?
It was part of a treaty. President Reagan and President Gorbachev signed a treaty. They were basically saying, you know what, the world is full of nuclear weapons. We got to start somewhere. And before we had limited the number we could have, and now this is the first time that we're going to actually ban something. And so they picked the intermediate range missiles to basically ban. And there were a lot of reasons going on in the 1980s. The Soviets were really nervous about us deploying intermediate range missiles to Europe that would be able to strike them. The Europeans didn't like the fact that we were deploying them because if we used them, the Soviets would attack in Europe, not against the United States, and so there was a lot of politics involved behind all that decision.
Politics.
Well, that's their job right at that level. So anyway, our job was to make sure they weren't producing them. And so I'm going to show you some pictures on Thursday of the facilities that we lived in, some of the things that we did, and you'll see there's a lot of snow and a lot of, because it snows like crazy in Russia, just like they said. I remember one time there was a little rail line. There was a road, and there was a little ditch, and there was a rail line next to it, and the rail car came out on the rail line, of course. And I walked off the road, and I just didn't appreciate the depth of that ditch.
As you disappeared.
Yeah, and I took a step, and it was like flunk down to about here in the snow. And I'm, struggling to get out of the snow, and the Russians are all chuckling at me. And I said to the Russian, I said, "Man, snow. This is what I think of when I think of Russia." And he's like, "Yeah, there's a good reason, There's a good reason that, man, I was up to it." And the Russians could ski. We also, this facility that we were basically monitoring, it was about, I want to say 2 or 3 miles around the exterior. And we would walk around the facility twice a day to make sure they didn't knock a hole in the back and, roll missiles out the back and then, close it up. So we would do that twice a day. And in the wintertime, you couldn't walk it very easily, you had to ski. And so the Russians taught us how to cross-country ski if we didn't know how to already.
That's so
And so we would cross-country ski around the factory twice a day to make sure they weren't doing it. And man, oh man, could they ski. I mean, I'd come back, it was like say 4 or 5 kilometers, and I'd come back drenching wet. And the Russians literally, I was just like walking, 100 feet to go to the bathroom or something. They weren't even breaking a sweat. But one of the guys, I have to tell you, one of the guys was a former Olympian. He had been on the Soviet Olympic team. So, I mean, this little ski for him was a complete joke. Yes, sir.
Why didn't you guys just use snowmobiles?
We actually at one point talked about that. The problem was we had to get them over there to start with. And, they're big and they're heavy. And then you'd have to maintain them. And then you'd have to potentially hire another guy to come out to the site and be there. You'd have to have a mechanic on site to keep them going. And eventually we just decided that, they'd be great to have, but, if they break and those kind of things, it's too much hassle. And if we did it, we'd have to provide them for the Russians too, and maintain theirs and all that kind of stuff.
They can get their own.
Well, their argument was, we'll be happy to walk or ski. You don't have to, the treaty did not give us the right to bring snowmobiles. So they said, if you want to bring them, you got to bring them for us too. You have to understand too that the Soviet Union, now Russia, was Russian during that time, is a poor country in many ways. I'll show you some pictures of how average Russians live. They are first world, meaning leading edge in military technologies and things like that. But the average person lives pretty poorly, and so they don't have a lot of extra money to do things. And that reminds me, I got to tell you real quick, and I'll probably mention it again on Thursday. You could always tell the difference between an American team going into Russia and a Russian team coming to the United States, because we went with bags and bags and bags of stuff. We had clothes, we had all our toiletries, we had CDs, we had everything that we would want because we would go for 6 weeks at a time. We'd have a whole bunch of stuff, and we would also carry over coolers of food, all kinds of things. And then twice a year we'd fly in frozen food to stock up. We had a big cooler and all kinds of stuff. And then we would leave with almost nothing. We would consume all of our stuff while we're there, and then we would leave with a few trinkets that we bought. You guys have seen the little nesting dolls?
Yes.
The Matryoshka, one inside the other. We'd have those kind of things and various other things. The Russians were the exact opposite. They would fly into Washington, D.C. or San Francisco, depending on where they were going, and they would come in with nothing. They would literally have a little tiny bag with a change of clothes and toothbrush and that kind of stuff. And then they would leave 6 weeks later, and they would carry out bags and bags and bags of stuff, because while they were here, they would go shopping for their wives and girlfriends and parents and friends and whoever, right? And so I remember on many occasions Russians saying, "Where can I get, so-and-so?" Well, go to Walmart, it must be Revlon Cosmetics. Why does it have to be Revlon? Because that's what my wife wants. Because she heard it was, good or something. And so, they were very specific in jeans and other stuff. I actually had a guy ask me one time, I was over in Russia, and one of the guys, he was one of the security guys there at the site that worked with us. He asked me one time, he says, I was a major then, he says, "Major, I have a favor to ask." I said, "What's that?" He says, when I was in America last year, bought a weed whacker. He was very, very proud of his gas-powered weed whacker, because he would use it out by his dacha, which is like a country place, kind of like a cabin to get out of the city. And he had this weed whacker, and he says, "I love that weed whacker, but I don't have any more string." He had used all the coil and the spool, and so he said, "I would really appreciate it if you would get me some spool for that." So I called back, and somebody ran out of the store, for $4 or something, and they sent over some spool on the next trip. And he was so thankful because he couldn't get access to a lot of things over in Russia that we just take for granted because we just run to the store and grab it. So anyway, some of the differences between trips. So anyway, to make a long story short, I did that for 3 years. I went back and forth between Washington, D.C., where my family was, and over into Russia, and we did inspections. And then at the end of that whole thing, it was time for me to move. On average, officers, especially as you get older, and higher in rank, you move every 2 or 3 years. So it was my turn to go, and I was trying really hard to get to Europe. I'd never been stationed in Europe. And the Air Force decided, man, because you have some background in Korea, you need to go back to Korea. So I went right back to Korea after 3 years. For 2 more years, went right back to the same Army post that I had lived at before. But this time I worked for what was called a human intelligence operation. Our job was to basically collect information. There's different kinds of intelligence work out there. There's like IMINT, which is pictures, image intelligence. You can do ELINT, which is electronics. You can do SIGINT, signals intelligence. Human intelligence, which is talking to people and that kind of stuff. And so I went over and I was deputy commander for a unit for a couple years doing that kind of work. I can't say a whole lot about what we did just because it's classified, and I signed all kinds of agreements when I left the service. Says I will not review classified information under penalty of imprisonment and fines and
Wow,
that kind of
okay.
stuff. But it's just, I mean, that's just the nature of the business, right? If you get into that world, into the intelligence world, there's a lot of things that you have access to that you just can't talk about. It's just the nature of the business. My wife used to drive her crazy because I would come home from work.
And you can't tell her about.
Yeah, and she'd say, "What'd you do today?" And I said, "Well, a lot of stuff."
She'd be like what? Like what?
Yeah, and she'd ask me, I'd say, I can't tell you, honey. All I can tell you is Joe was a jerk today. Well, what was he a jerk about? I can't tell you. What he was a jerk about. And so,
You'll have to take my word for it.
she got pretty tired of it. I can't tell you. And then, there's an old joke about it, if I told you I'd have to kill you. That's not true.
Yeah,
But anyway, that's just the world that intelligence operators work in. The one thing I will tell you about the intelligence world is there's a lot of very interesting work going on, and one of the things that unfortunately intelligence guys don't get is enough recognition, because imagine working in a world where nobody gets to know when you succeed, because you can't tell them.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And so
I hate
there were many, many times where things, worked out well for us, and because of some great intelligence work, and the intelligence community is patting you on the back like crazy, but nobody else knows anything about what you're doing, and you can't tell them. And so you have to go into that world knowing that it's enough for you to feel good about, yourself and what you did and all that. You don't need the world to pat you on the back, because in that world you're not going to get too many outside pats on the back. And people expect you to know everything, and reality is nobody has a crystal ball. You can't, read
You
the
don't need to
future.
know your shoulders.
Yeah, you can only do as much as you can. So anyway, if you are interested in that kind of world, come and see me, and I'll tell you more about what it's like, but without getting into the details. After my second tour in Korea, I'd been over there 4 out of the last 7 years. I actually had not been on an Air Force base for 7 years. How deep was it? But I hadn't been on an Air Force base for 7 years. I mean, I stepped on it, but I hadn't been stationed there. And so I thought, it'd kind of be nice to kind of be back in the more regular Air Force. And I applied for an ROTC job, which is as an instructor at the college level. And I got selected. I was actually very, very fortunate, because I talked to the personnel guys, said I want to go to be an ROTC guy. And the first thing the guy asked me was, "Do you have 20 years or more in the service?" And I said, "No, I've got 18. And what he was basically saying is, "You can't retire if I say no." And so he said, "Oh, you only got 18. I can't release you. I only have to send one guy this year from the intelligence career field as a lieutenant colonel. I only have to send one guy this year to go be an ROTC commander, and he's going to have at least 20 years, because I want to give it to somebody that can retire if I don't give it to him." And I just, in passing, said, "Man, I thought you guys were going to take care of me after doing 4 years out of the last 7 in Korea." And he goes, "What are you talking about, 4 years in Korea in the last 7? I said, "Take a look at my record." And I hear, he's on his computer calling me up. And he goes, "Wow, man, yeah, you took a couple jobs that were tough to fill." And I'm like, "Yeah, I thought you guys were supposed to take care of me." Of course, I was playing it hard, playing it on thick. And he goes, "Well, man," he goes, "well, I got to give one guy this year." And I go, "Why not me?" And he says, "Okay, I'll release you." Meaning I could go compete for this outside of my regular career field. And I said, "Okay, when will I find out I'm released?" And he goes, "Click, click," and he goes, "You're released. You can meet the board." He says, "Good luck." And so sure enough, I was the one guy that year that got picked as an intel guy to go be an ROTC commander. And got a phone call from Personnel Center not long after that saying, "Congratulations, you've been selected to be a commander for ROTC unit. You're going to Indiana University." And it was one of my lower choices, on my list. And I said, "Well, do I have a choice?" And she goes, "Well, yeah, you can take it or not take it."
There's always a choice.
Yeah, and I said, "Okay, I'll take it." So off we went to Bloomington, Indiana, which proved to be phenomenal. It's a great little town, about an hour south of Indianapolis. The University of Indiana University is right there. And we absolutely loved it. We spent 3 years there. I was the commander for those 3 years. And at the end of that time, we decided that it was time to come home and be closer to family. I've got some family here in Arizona. My wife's parents live here in Prescott. so she wanted to come to Prescott to be closer. And I told my wife, I said, you know what, I've dragged you around for 21 years, the least I can do is go where you want to go in retirement. So we came here to Prescott, and we've been here almost, 8 years? Yeah, 8 years.
Isn't
It's hard to
Prescott the top 10 places to retire to in the world?
Yeah, I actually saw a thing not too long ago that said that Prescott was high on the list. I didn't ever read it myself. If you think about it, Prescott's a very desirable place. The weather is mild all year.
So it's like sporadic though.
There's not a lot of traffic. Retirees don't care about the job market, so whether there's a lot of jobs here, it doesn't matter. There's all kinds of volunteer things. Yavapai College, Prescott College, Amarillo, there's a lot of things that go on in this town. You're only an hour and a half from Phoenix. There's a lot of things that make Prescott very desirable as a retiree, especially. Yes, sir.
How long do you have to serve in the Air Force before you can leave the Air Force?
The minimum amount for an officer is typically 4 years. When you go through ROTC training, you sign a 4-year commitment when you go in the Air Force. Unless you go to a career field that takes a considerable length of time to train, like flying. How many folks in here might be interested in being a pilot? Okay, if you are interested in being a pilot, it's a very, very extensive training program. You would go through a year of pilot training, what we call undergraduate pilot training. So you spend a year just learning how to fly, and then after that, you go off